So another thing the idea about choosing those readings, and we'll talk about some of the groups a little bit later on here, but it could be just group discussion, but you can also use online voting platforms like OpaVote and kind of do like a ranked choice vote as to what your readings are also, so there are different democratic ways of choosing what your next text is going to be, so try to decide on that. So when we do each session, try to have an agenda, and we'll show you that agenda here in a second, as a template. But, before each session, have an agenda. It can be as formal and informal as you want it to be. A reading guide, which is not required, but just have some sort of guide as to, this is what we're going to be discussing and everything. So an example of that is I did a reading group around consent. So I provided everyone, here's the reading list, the zine about consent, and I chose a queer activist that talked about consent, and then I pulled some material from a clinic in Iowa City, the Emma Goldman clinic, that talks about consent as well. So like that was like our reading guide. That was a reading guide for that particular group. So it could look like that. And again, for marketing, if you have a Facebook event page, you can put your reading guide on there so people know before going in as to what the readings are going to be. And then, publicize it far and wide, use your social media, fly around town, talk to your friends, text your friends, just publicize it as far and wide as you can and everything. And I know we said we'll be very light on the publicity side of it, but Gary, what were some of the things that y'all did before when publicizing your first reading group or the series of reading groups you've had?
Yeah, I thought that social media worked pretty well, and we had a mailing list. Actually, there was a sign-up form that was made it really useful. You could use something like Action Network to create a form, and you could pass the link around, and the form actually has information about, here's the purpose of our reading group, and here's the day that we meet that's always regular so that people remember it. And here's kind of our upcoming readings, and you could click on the reading guides and see the next couple of readings so that people could kind of follow along with what happened in the past, what's coming up, and they could keep up with it. And those reading guides can be useful for, on an earlier slide, we talked about having a shared language. And I think the reading guides help with that kind of thing too, that as we're learning about new topics, there might be language that either we're not used to or maybe is even used differently from what you might see in typical newspapers or something like that. So that's kind of a moment where you can kind of help redefine things and help people think about stuff differently. So sometimes it takes a lot of practice. Well, not just sometimes, all the time. Anytime you're doing anything new, it takes lots of practice for you to get used to it and to understand. So the more often we can talk about the shared language and all, the more that we can learn from each other. Sometimes that's necessary, but be careful, of course, to know your audience. That if there's a bunch of new people, you don't want to dive too heavily into, really detailed theoretical academic stuff, right? And speaking of that, I just kind of want to mention that when we say readings here, it could be books and it could be articles, but it doesn't have to be academic articles, these journal articles that are really dense with all this theory and things like that. It could be something as simple as a magazine article or a newspaper article that's talking about current events. And then when your group gets together, we can talk about those current events within our framework from a green socialist point of view, stuff like, Murray Bookchin that we had mentioned before. What would be that lens on current events to get at the root causes and better understand it? So you can kind of think about all that stuff as you're putting together a reading guide. And of course, that's part of what the GSOP, what this is all about, right? Helping put together the reading guides, because lots of us have done this sort of thing before, so we can share what we've learned. What are the good tips at building the shared language and all. Go ahead, AJ.
Yes, and if we go to the next slide, and again, to reinforce Garrett said, yes, when we're talking about readings, it doesn't have to be, and I encourage folks not to go onto the academic side, because as someone who has to read that, because I'm finishing my master's up right now with that, academic language can be a little bit dense, and trying to break that down, can be a challenge at times, so choose readings that you feel is best, and if you do academic readings, I encourage all y'all to reach out to anyone that who may help you or the group better navigate around those kind of texts, because again, I can be challenging at times and everything. And then, yeah, so that's a very good point you made there, Garrett. So with this agenda, this is a sample agenda, it doesn't have to be the exact same times on here or what have you on here. So, again, this is something you can do, have some sort of like pregame. I call it pregame. I don't know why I call it pregame, but a pregame of those who are starting out with your session and everything. And that can be just texting or messaging each other back and forth to make sure everything's ready, making sure your video platform is working, what have you, making sure people have the readings and everything. And then, go from here. So, in this agenda, outside of the arrival and setup, this is a 2-hour session, so it can be 2 hours, and I would say no more than 2 hours. Just enough time just to get people settled into the reading that you're doing, the conversation you have, Q&A, and then, whatever you guys feel needs to resolve that session and everything. This is a schedule. And then, if you do an agenda like this, make sure you stick to whatever agenda you have. And if you need to make adjustments along the way, that's fine also. If we go to the next slide, it's also important when you do your reading groups. It's like even in a meeting,